I am the oldest of Lillian and Louis Zabar's 8 grandchildren. In the Ashkenazic European Jewish tradition, a child is often given the name of a deceased relative, but never a living one. Because many of those Yiddish-based European names sounded quaint and old-fashioned to first-generation Americans, it became the custom to come up with a name for a newborn that used just the first letter of the departed's name. So I was named Lori after my grandfather Louis, who died 4 years before I was born in 1954. Although I was close to my grandmother Lily, who died in 1995 at age 93, I grew up knowing little about my grandparents' childhoods in Russia or their early years in America. To understand how these 2 immigrants from a small Russian shtetl created an institution synonymous with cosmopolitan Jewish New York, I relied on my skills as an art historian and retired attorney. I interviewed relatives and Zabars employees, did research in libraries, including the Center for Jewish History and the New York Public Library, and mined digital genealogical, municipal, and newspaper archives. What I know about my grandfather's formative years came from stories that had been passed down by my grandmother, by Louis's sisters, my great-aunts Ada and Rose, by my parents and my uncles Saul and Eli, and what I'd heard from my cousins. They all agreed that my grandfather was a complex man, gruff, kind, generous, demanding, temperamental, charismatic, loyal, ambitious, and stubborn. Louis Zabar was born Mordko, which is the Russian equivalent of the Hebrew Mordechai, Leib Zabarka, in 1901 in Ostropolia, the Yiddish version of Ostropol, which at the time was part of Tsarist Russia and is now located in Ukraine. One of many small towns nestled in the province of Volhynia. In 1901, Ostropolia was home to 10,000 inhabitants, 2,800 of whom were Jews. Encircled by crystalline lakes, dense pine forests, fragrant orchards, and rich farmland, it is bisected by a narrow, winding river called the Sluch. The closest major city, Kyiv, is some 140 miles southwest, and at the time, the nearest railroad was 30 miles away in Polonna. Virtually all of Ostropolia's 300 Jewish families lived in the town's historic center. Despite their geographic isolation and the restrictions the government had placed on travel and professions for Jews, Ostropolia's Jews were active participants in the local economy. They maintained 90 shops, where they traded with one another and with the Gentiles who lived in town or on farms in the surrounding countryside, and they worked for and traded with a small group of wealthy Gentiles who owned estates. They also were employed by the flour and corn mills, the main businesses of the region. Louis's father, Shlomo Zabarka, was a big macher, a man of consequence. Born in 1870, Shlomo was an entrepreneur, both a retailer and a trader, who maintained a lumber yard on the grounds of the family home. His partner managed the lumber enterprise while Shlomo traveled throughout Ukraine with a hired driver and horse-drawn carriage, buying and selling commodities such as wheat, nuts, and butter, and supplies that included construction materials and apothecary jars. Ukraine was, at that time, part of an area that had been designated by the Russian government in the 18th century as the Pale of Settlement, territory that fell within what had been Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Moldova, as well as Western Russia, in which the Jews of the Russian Empire were forced to live. The 4.2 million Jews residing there were not allowed to travel beyond the Pale, and if they were caught doing so, they were arrested and returned in chains. Despite the risk, Shlomo broke this rule when he felt he needed to, journeying to Austrian-controlled Galicia, for example, to secure butter during a shortage. Shlomo was a yeller, a man who screamed until things were done to his satisfaction, and he brusquely mentored young Louis, whom he called Leib, in the ways of the commercial world. Louis, a strong, stocky boy with dark, wavy hair and piercing blue eyes, was an enthusiastic pupil.